Hey guys, tonight we're pulling back the velvet curtain on the four most famous young men of the 20th century, the ones who turned a few haircuts and a handful of chords into a global earthquake. Not the tidy version from the greatest hits covers, not the smiling lads waving from the tarmac. I mean the real story behind the fame, the screaming, the exhaustion, the sleepless hotel rooms, and the strange loneliness of being adored by millions of people who never actually met you. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And a heartfelt thank you to the listener who suggested tonight's journey. Your ideas are what keep this whole thing alive, and I read every single one. Let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you, because somehow it is always the middle of the night somewhere. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft steady hum, and settle in. Let us wonder together for a moment. Have you ever wondered what it actually feels like to be so famous that you cannot hear yourself sing over 30,000 screaming strangers? Did any of them ever get a single quiet moment alone, or did fame follow them into every car, every hotel, every dream? What do you eat when you cannot leave your room without starting a riot? Could you keep your oldest friends close when the entire planet suddenly wanted a piece of them? And what happens to four ordinary boys from a rainy port city when the whole world decides, all at once, that they belong to everyone? Tonight we find out. The year is 1957, a damp afternoon in Liverpool, and two teenage boys are about to meet at a church fete and accidentally rewrite music forever. They have no idea what is coming, neither do you. Before the screaming, before the private cars, before the whole world knew their faces, there was only Liverpool, a grey and battered port city still digging itself out of the rubble of the Second World War. It was a place of shipyards and rain, of tight terraced houses and even tighter budgets, where music leaked out of pubs and radios and gave working-class kids something to dream about. John, Paul, George and Richard grew up within a few miles of one another, none of them aware the others existed, all of them shaped by the same salt air and the same restless hunger for something larger than the life laid out for them. To understand the band, you have to understand the city, because Liverpool was not a gentle place to be a child in those years. German bombs had fallen hard on the docks during the war, leaving whole streets gap-toothed with rubble, and the boys grew up playing in bombed-out lots that their parents still spoke of in hushed tones. Money was scarce. Meat was rationed well into their childhoods. A family that owned a radio was doing well, and a family with a gramophone was practically aristocracy. This was not the swinging, glamorous Britain of later legend. It was cold, damp, and hard. The sort of place that taught you early to make your own fun or go without. And yet Liverpool had something most cities did not. As a great seaport, it was a doorway to the world. Ships came and went from America constantly, and the sailors who worked them brought back records that could not yet be bought anywhere else in the country. Rhythm and blues, rockabilly, the raw early sounds of American rock and roll, all of it arrived on the docks like contraband and spread through the city long before the rest of Britain caught on. A teenager in Liverpool in the 1950s could hear music that a teenager in London had never even heard of. It gave the whole city a strange musical head start, and the boys drank it in. Then came the craze that changed everything. A homegrown, do-it-yourself. Style built on cheap guitars, washboards, and a tea chest strung with a broomstick for a bass. It required almost no money and almost no training, only enthusiasm, and it swept through working-class Britain like a fever. Suddenly every street seemed to have a group of lads banging away in someone's front room. For boys with no instruments worth the name and no prospects beyond the factory gate, it was a revelation. You did not need to be rich or trained or connected. You just needed a guitar, 3 chords, and the nerve to stand up in front of people. For a certain kind of restless Liverpool teenager, that was the most exciting news imaginable. The city was full of them. dreamers stuck between a childhood of rationing and a future that seemed to offer only the docks or a desk they would hate. Music was the one door that appeared to lead somewhere else, somewhere brighter and louder and entirely their own. None of them could have told you where it might go. They only knew that when they played, the grey city fell away and something else took its place. 4 of those boys, scattered across the same handful of neighbourhoods, were about to find one another. And it would begin, as these things so often do, with the loudest and most troubled of them all. John Winston Lennon arrived in the world in 1940, during a war, and his early life had the chaos of one. Raised largely by his no-nonsense Aunt Mimi after his parents drifted out of the picture, John grew into a sharp-tongued, quick-witted boy who hid a great deal of hurt behind a wall of jokes. He was clever but rebellious, far more interested in causing trouble and strumming a cheap guitar than in anything a classroom could offer. Long before he was a legend, he was simply an angry, funny, grieving kid looking for a way to be heard. His childhood was a tangle of absence. His father, a merchant seaman, vanished from his life early, off at sea and then simply gone. His mother, a warm and free-spirited woman named Julia, was present but not steady, and in a decision that would haunt John for the rest of his days, he was handed over to be raised by her sister Mimi and Mimi's husband in a comfortable, orderly house on the edge of the city. Mimi loved him fiercely and ran a tight ship, all manners and rules and disapproval of anything that looked like idleness. John, who was allergic to rules from birth, pushed against her at every turn. He was, by every account, a difficult boy. He drew rude cartoons, mocked his teachers, led other children into trouble, and treated authority as a personal insult. But beneath the swagger lived a sharp and hungry mind. He devoured books, filled notebooks with strange stories and drawings, and possessed a gift for wordplay that his exasperated teachers never quite knew what to do with. He was too smart to fail and too wild to succeed, the kind of pupil who ends up written off by a school that has no idea what it is looking at. Everything shifted when his mother came back into his orbit. As a teenager, John began spending real time with Julia again, and she turned out to be exactly the sort of parent Mimi was not. She was fun, playful, and musical, and it was Julia who first showed him how to pick out chords on a banjo, planting the seed that would grow into his entire life. For a while it seemed as though the wound of his childhood might finally close. Mother and son, reunited, laughing together over music. Then, in 1958, tragedy struck with brutal suddenness. Julia was killed, hit by a car near Mimi's home, just as John had begun to know her as a person rather than a memory. He was 17. The loss cut him open in a way he rarely spoke of directly, and the grief hardened into something that would drive him for decades, surfacing again and again in his songs. He'd lost his mother twice, first to his aunt, and then to death, and the ache of it never fully left him. That pain became fuel. John threw himself into music with an intensity that bordered on desperation, because when he played, the anger and the grief finally had somewhere to go. He had formed a scrappy skiffle group with schoolmates, named it after his old school, and appointed himself its unquestioned leader. He could barely play, tuned his guitar like a banjo because that was all his mother had taught him, and made up lyrics when he forgot the real ones. But he had presence, and nerve, and a voice that could cut through anything. He was searching for something, though he could not have named it. What he needed was someone who could match him, challenge him, and quietly make him better. On a damp July afternoon, at a church fete just up the road, that someone was standing in the crowd. On a damp afternoon in July of 1957, at a church fete in the Liverpool suburb of Woolton, 2 teenagers crossed paths for the first time. John was up on a makeshift stage with his ramshackle skiffle group, faking his way through half-remembered lyrics. In the crowd stood a baby-faced 15-year-old named Paul McCartney, who afterward picked up a guitar and to everyone's quiet surprise played it properly, tuned it, and knew all the words. It was a small, ordinary moment at a small, ordinary event, and it changed the course of popular music forever. The day itself was pure English village ritual. There was a parade through the streets, stalls selling cakes and second-hand goods, children in their Sunday best, and a decorated lorry to carry the entertainment. John's group, dressed in checked shirts, banged out their set on the back of that lorry to a modest crowd of neighbours and parents. John was the clear leader, all attitude and confidence, covering up the gaps in his musical knowledge with sheer force of personality. He did not know the proper chords. He did not always know the proper words. He simply committed, loudly, and dared anyone to notice. Paul had been brought along by a mutual friend who thought the two might get on. He watched John perform with a mixture of admiration and quiet judgment, because Paul, though younger, already knew a great deal more about how music actually worked. He had taught himself guitar with real discipline after the recent death of his own mother, pouring his grief into practice the way John poured his into performance. The two boys had that terrible thing in common, though neither knew it yet. Both had lost their mothers young. Both had learned to hide it. After the set in a church hall beside the field, the friend introduced them. Paul, wanting to make an impression, borrowed a guitar and launched into a rock and roll number, playing it cleanly, singing every word, and even flipping the instrument to play left-handed without missing a beat. Then he did something that genuinely stunned the older boys. He tuned the guitar, a skill none of them had properly mastered, and wrote out the lyrics to several American songs from memory. To a group who had been faking their way along, this was something close to sorcery. John now faced a decision that says everything about who he was. Paul was obviously the more capable musician, and inviting him in meant sharing the spotlight, risking being outshone in his own band. For a proud and insecure 17-year-old still raw from his mother's death, that was no small thing. John thought it over for a couple of weeks, weighing his ego against his ambition. In the end, ambition won. He decided he would rather have a great band than be the biggest fish in a small and sinking one. Word came through the same mutual friend. Paul was invited to join. It was a quiet, almost casual arrangement. Two teenagers agreeing to make music together, with no sense whatsoever of the machinery of history clicking into place around them. There were no contracts, no handshakes for the cameras, no witnesses who understood what they had just seen. There was only a church hall, a borrowed guitar, and two grieving gifted boys recognizing something in each other. From that afternoon grew the most celebrated songwriting partnership the world has ever known. But a partnership needs more than two, and the group still lacked the pieces that would complete it. One of those pieces was already close at hand, riding the same bus to school as Paul each morning, guitar case in hand and stars in his eyes. Paul McCartney was everything John was not. Polished where John was raw, careful where John was careless, and blessed with an easy melodic instinct that seemed to come from nowhere. When John invited him to join the group, the two began writing songs side by side, the start of one of the most successful partnerships in history. Before long, Paul brought along a shy, serious younger friend named George Harrison, a boy obsessed with his guitar and the exact way a chord should ring. The core was forming, one Liverpool teenager at a time. The bond between John and Paul was immediate and complicated, part friendship, part rivalry, and part something like a creative marriage. They began meeting at Paul's house, guitars across their knees, working out songs together while Paul's father was out at work. They wrote facing each other, almost as mirror images, one right-handed and one left, and quickly discovered that what one lacked the other supplied. Paul softened John's hard edges. John toughened Paul's sweetness. Each pushed the other to be sharper, and each hated to be beaten, which meant neither ever stopped trying. Then came George. He was younger than the others by a meaningful margin, still very much a schoolboy, and he had befriended Paul on the long bus rides to the institute they both attended. George was quiet, watchful, and utterly devoted to the guitar in a way that went beyond the others. Where John played on nerve and Paul on instinct, George played on sheer relentless practice, working out difficult solos note by note until his fingers ached. Music was not a hobby for him, it was the whole point. Paul kept telling John about this talented kid he knew, and eventually he arranged for the two to meet. The story goes that George auditioned for John on the top deck of a late-night bus, running through a tricky instrumental to prove he could play. And play he could. But John hesitated, and the reason was almost comically petty. George was simply too young. He looked like a child, to a group trying desperately to seem older and cooler than they were. Dragging along a boy who still had homework felt like a liability. George, to his enormous credit, didn't take no for an answer. He kept showing up, kept hanging around, kept quietly demonstrating that he was the best guitarist any of them had heard up close. His playing was tidy, confident, and years ahead of his age. Eventually John relented, won over not by charm but by talent, and George was in. The age gap that had worried John would soon vanish entirely, because a shared purpose has a way of erasing a few years between teenagers. Now there was a nucleus. 3 guitarists who could write, sing and play, bound by ambition and a common escape from grief and grey streets. They practiced obsessively, adopted and discarded band names, and cycled through a string of drummers and hangers on who never quite stuck. The lineup was still incomplete, and would remain unstable for years. A proper drummer eluded them. A bass player was needed. The Polish that would one day define them was nowhere in sight. What they had instead was raw material and a fierce, unspoken belief that they were going somewhere. They were rough, under-rehearsed, and dirt poor, playing whatever tiny gigs they could scrounge. But the songwriting engine at the heart of the group was already humming, and the quiet perfectionist on lead guitar was already sharpening the sound. All they needed now was a crucible hot enough to forge them into something real. They would find it, improbably, in the neon-lit gutters of a German port city hundreds of miles from home. In 1960, the still unknown group travelled to Hamburg, in Germany, to play the rough and rowdy clubs of the city's red light district. What they found there was less a booking and more a trial by fire. They played for hours on end, night after night, in smoke-filled rooms packed with sailors and gangsters, sleeping in a filthy back room behind a cinema. Hamburg nearly broke them, but it also forged them, turning a scrappy pack of amateurs into a tight, hardened live act that could hold any room in the palm of its hand. The offer came through a Liverpool contact who arranged for young British groups to fill the endless demand for live music in Hamburg's booming club scene. By this point the band had picked up a bass player, John's art school friend, and a drummer recruited almost at the last minute so they would have a full lineup to take abroad. They piled into a cramped van, crossed the sea, and arrived in a city unlike anything they had ever seen. A sprawling, glittering, dangerous place where the bars never seemed to close, and the district they were headed for pulsed with vice around the clock. Their accommodation set the tone. They were housed behind the screen of a rundown cinema, in windowless rooms next to the toilets, so cold and grim that they could hear the films playing on the other side of the wall as they tried to sleep. They washed in the cinema's public facilities. They had almost no money, and they were expected to play and play and play for a demanding crowd of drunks, dock workers and criminals who would turn on a dull band in an instant. The club owners had one relentless instruction, shouted at them again and again. Make a show! Do not just stand there. Move, sweat, holler, put on a spectacle. Because a still band was a boring band, and a boring band emptied the room. So the group learned to perform with their whole bodies. They stomped, they yelled, they clowned, they played the same songs harder and wilder than the records ever dared. John in particular took the instruction to heart, hurling himself around the stage with a manic energy that could be thrilling or unnerving depending on his mood. The hours were inhuman. On a normal night they might play for 4 or 5 hours. On weekends the sets could stretch far longer. An exhausting marathon that would have flattened seasoned professionals, let alone teenagers. There was no way to fill that much time with polish alone, so they filled it with everything they had, improvising, stretching songs out, learning to read a crowd and hold it. Necessity taught them more in a few months than years of safe little Liverpool gigs ever could. By the time their first stint ended, they were a different band. The endless nights had welded them into a unit that could play tightly, loudly, and confidently through any chaos a room could throw at them. They had also picked up the leather-clad, tough-looking style of the Hamburg scene, trading their earlier neatness for something harder and more dangerous. The trip did not end cleanly. The youngest member was discovered to be under the legal age for the clubs and was sent home, and a minor incident involving a small fire in their old cinema quarters saw others sent back soon after. They limped home to Liverpool bruised and broke but transformed. The city that had greeted their departure with indifference would barely recognise the act that returned. Hamburg had cost them dearly in sleep, comfort, and eventually in far worse, but it had made them formidable, and it had left one hard habit behind that helped them survive those brutal nights. The Hamburg sets were merciless, sometimes stretching well past 8 hours a night with barely a pause. To survive them, the young musicians leaned on the cheap stimulant pills that circulated freely through the clubs, a common crutch for performers expected to stay loud and lively until dawn. It was a punishing routine of a little sleep, poor food, and constant noise, the kind of grind that would have flattened most people. Yet out of that exhaustion came a strange kind of alchemy, a raw stamina and hunger that would soon set them apart from every other band in Britain. It is worth pausing to understand just how far beyond ordinary human endurance those nights ran. A modern concert lasts a couple of hours and leaves performers drained. The Hamburg groups were expected to play for a whole working day's worth of hours, over and over, week after week, with the crowd churning constantly beneath them. Sailors arrived, drank, left, and were replaced by new sailors, so the band could never coast on a familiar audience. Every hour demanded fresh energy from young men who were already running on empty. The pills were simply part of that world. They were a legal stimulant at the time, widely used and easy to come by, passed around by waitresses and fellow musicians as casually as cigarettes. Their effect was to hold off sleep and keep the body moving long after it wanted to stop. For a band contracted to play through the night, they seemed less like an indulgence and more like a tool of the trade, the only way to meet demands that no rested person could have met. None of this was glamorous, and it should not be dressed up as such. It was the behaviour of exhausted, underfed teenagers pushing their bodies well past healthy limits to keep a job that barely paid. The routine took a real toll. They lived on scraps, drank too much, smoked constantly, and slept in snatches whenever the schedule allowed. It was the kind of lifestyle that ages a person quickly, and it planted appetites and habits that some of them would wrestle with for years to come. But there was, undeniably, a hard-edged gift buried inside all that misery. The relentless demand forged a work ethic and a stamina that few bands anywhere could match. Playing for so many hours, so many nights, they learned their instruments and one another with a depth that only sheer repetition can bring. They discovered how to keep a set alive when they were half dead on their feet, how to feed off a crowd's energy when their own was gone, how to turn tiredness into a strange wired intensity that audiences found electric. They also built an enormous repertoire out of pure necessity. To fill those endless hours, they had to learn hundreds of songs, borrowing from American rock and roll, rhythm and blues, show tunes, and anything else that might hold a room. That vast library of material, absorbed under pressure, gave them a range and a confidence that more comfortable bands lacked. When they finally faced a normal, civilized concert of ordinary length, it must have felt almost laughably easy. By the end of their Hamburg apprenticeship, they had paid a steep physical price, but they had also become one of the most battle-hardened live acts in Europe, even if hardly anyone back home yet knew it. The lesson of those long nights was simple and unforgiving. Greatness, at least the kind they were chasing, was not going to be handed to them. It would have to be earned in the dark, one exhausting hour at a time. And soon they would carry that hard-won power back to a single sweaty basement in Liverpool, where the real love affair with their home city was about to begin. Back home in Liverpool, the band found their spiritual headquarters in a sweaty, dripping basement club called the Cavern. There, at lunchtime and late into the evening, they built a devoted local following, cramming the low-ceilinged cellar with fans who returned day after day. The sound bounced off the brick, the air grew thick and warm, and something electric began to gather. Liverpool fell for them first, long before the rest of the world had any notion of what was coming. The Cavern sat down a narrow side street in the heart of the city, reached by a steep flight of stone steps that descended into what had once been a produce and wine cellar. It was small, airless, and famously unpleasant in the best possible way. The ceiling was so low that taller patrons had to stoop. Condensation ran down the walls and dripped from overhead. The heat of packed bodies turned it into a kind of underground sauna, and the smell, a rich blend of sweat, smoke, and disinfectant, was something regulars remembered for the rest of their lives. It should not have been the launchpad for anything. It was perfect. The club had started life catering to jazz enthusiasts, who at first looked down on the loud new beat music the youngsters were bringing in, but tastes were shifting fast, and the raw, hard-driving sound the band had carried back from Germany was exactly what a restless young audience wanted. The lunchtime sessions became legendary. Office workers, shop girls, and students would rush over on their breaks, cram into the cellar, eat their sandwiches and watch the group tear through a set before hurrying back to work with their ears ringing. What the audience saw was a band transformed by Hamburg. Gone were the timid, under-rehearsed teenagers of a couple of years earlier. In their place stood a tight, confident, slightly menacing group in leather, joking with the crowd between numbers, cranking out song after song with an ease that came only from having played them 1,000 times in far worse conditions. They talked to the audience, teased regulars by name, and created an atmosphere that felt less like a performance and more like a party thrown by friends. The bond between band and city deepened with astonishing speed. The group played the Cavern again and again, hundreds of appearances over the coming years, until they became fixtures, local heroes, the pride of the neighbourhood. Fans came not once but constantly, learning the songs, claiming favourite spots, following the band from venue to venue across the city. A genuine grassroots devotion took root, the kind that cannot be manufactured, built one sweaty lunchtime at a time. It was in this period that the sense of the group as something special first crystallised. They were not yet famous beyond their own region, but within Liverpool they were becoming legends, the best of a crowded local scene teeming with beat groups all chasing the same dream. Their songwriting set them apart, because unlike most bands who played only covers, they were increasingly slipping in their own original numbers, and the crowds responded. But talent and a loyal local following, however fierce, were not enough on their own. Liverpool was a long way from the centres of the music business, dismissed by many in London as a provincial backwater. Plenty of brilliant groups played their whole careers in cellars like the Cavern and were never heard of anywhere else. What the band needed was someone with connections, ambition and belief, someone who could carry them out of the basement and into the wider world. That someone was about to walk down those steep stone steps in a smart suit and out of pure curiosity, with no idea that the scruffy group he was about to watch would change his life as completely as he would change theirs. Brian Epstein was a well-dressed, soft-spoken young man who ran a local record shop and had never managed a band in his life. When he wandered into the Cavern and watched them play, something clicked, and he became convinced this scruffy, leather-clad group could become bigger than Elvis. He cleaned them up, put them in matching suits, taught them to bow at the end of a set, and threw himself completely into making the world take notice. Without Brian, the story might well have ended in that basement. Brian came from a comfortable Liverpool family that ran a successful chain of furniture and electrical shops, and he had been given charge of the record department, which he ran with genuine flair. He was cultured, sensitive, and impeccably turned out, a world away from the rough young men he was about to devote his life to. By his own account, he first heard of the band when customers began asking for a record they had made in Germany while backing another singer. Intrigued that a local group had cut a record at all, he decided to go and see them for himself. What he found in that basement astonished him. The music was raw and the setting was squalid, and the boys on stage smoked, ate, swore, and turned up late as the mood took them. Yet there was a magnetism to them that Brian could not shake. He watched them and felt, with a certainty that surprised even himself, that they had something the whole world would eventually want. He went back again, and then he made his move. He offered to become their manager, and they accepted, more or less on a handshake and a leap of faith on both sides. It was a strange match. Brian knew almost nothing about managing a band, and they knew almost nothing about the polite, moneyed world he moved in. But he brought exactly the qualities they lacked: organisation, ambition, respectability, and an unshakable belief that overrode every rejection to come. His first task was to make them presentable to a business that would never take a scruffy cellar act seriously. This meant changes the band did not universally love. He coaxed them out of their leather and into smart matching suits. He insisted they stop eating and smoking on stage, arrive on time, and finish each set with a neat, unified bow. John in particular chafed at being tidied up, suspicious of anything that smelled of selling out. But they trusted Brian's instincts, and the transformation worked. The dangerous Hamburg toughs became clean, charming, and marketable, without losing the wit and energy that made them special. Brian's devotion went far beyond image. He poured his own money, time, and reputation into them, hauling their recordings around London, badgering executives, and refusing to accept that a group from the provinces could not make it. He handled the endless practical burdens they had no patience for, shielding them from the business so they could focus on the music. In doing so, he became far more than a manager. He became a kind of fifth member, the steady adult centre around which the whole enterprise turned. There was a private cost to all of this that few around him understood at the time. Brian carried burdens of his own in an era that was cruel and unforgiving to men like him, and he quietly channeled much of his loneliness into the band's success, which became the great project of his life. His faith in them was total, almost desperate, and it would prove to be the single most important belief in their early story. For now, though, that success was still only a promise, and even a believer as fierce as Brian was about to discover just how many doors could be slammed in a man's face. Getting the band a record deal proved far harder than Brian had imagined. He hauled their tapes from label to label across London, and door after door closed in his face. One famous audition ended with the group being turned down flat, dismissed with the notion that guitar bands were finished and on their way out. It was a bruising stretch of near misses and polite refusals, the kind of rejection that ends most musical dreams before they begin. Brian, stubborn to his core, simply refused to give up. The problem was partly geography and partly snobbery. London was the centre of the British music industry, and the executives who ran it tended to regard anything from the north of England as hopelessly unfashionable. A well-spoken record man from Liverpool arriving with tapes of a beat group from a cellar was to many of them faintly absurd. They had heard it all before. Every city had its local heroes, and almost none of them amounted to anything. Brian's certainty struck them as the enthusiasm of an amateur who did not know the odds. The most painful blow came from a major label that actually granted the band a proper studio audition on the very first day of 1962. The group drove down from Liverpool through terrible winter weather, nervous and cold, and ran through a set of songs chosen partly to show their range. They were tense, the material was uneven, and the results were far from their best. Weeks later, the verdict came back. The label passed. The reason given became one of the most quoted misjudgments in music history. The flat pronouncement that groups with guitars were on the way out. It stung deeply. The rejection was not just a professional setback, but a personal humiliation for Brian, who had staked his credibility on these boys, and a discouragement for the band, who had begun to wonder whether the whole dream was a fantasy. Other labels followed suit. Brian trudged from office to office, playing the tapes, making his case, and collecting no thank yous. By the standards of the industry, the band had been fairly and thoroughly rejected. The sensible thing would have been to accept it. Brian did not. His belief in them bordered on the irrational, and it was exactly that irrationality that saved them. He kept pushing, kept knocking, kept refusing to hear the word no as final. He had the tapes transferred to disc to make them sound more professional, hoping better presentation might win over ears that had dismissed a rough recording. And in the course of doing so, through a chain of chance encounters and dogged persistence, he found his way to a producer at a small and slightly unfashionable division of a large company, a man who ran a label better known for comedy and novelty records than for rock and roll. That producer agreed to hear them. It was not a triumphant breakthrough so much as one more meeting in a long string of them, arranged almost as a last resort. Nobody involved treated it as a landmark. The band was simply another hopeful act getting a chance to audition, and the odds, given everything that had come before, did not look good. They had been turned away so many times that another rejection would have surprised no one, but this meeting would be different, though none of them could have known it. The man on the other side of the glass had a curious, open mind, an appetite for the unconventional, and a willingness to take a gamble that his more cautious rivals had all refused. The band's long run of closed doors was about to end, and it would end in the hands of a quiet, cultured producer who would help shape their sound for the rest of their lives. Salvation finally arrived in the form of George Martin, a classically trained producer at a modest division of a large record company who agreed to take a chance on them. Calm, cultured, and endlessly patient, Martin became a kind of musical father figure, the one adult in the room who could translate their wild ideas into finished records. He heard something in these rough young men that everyone else had missed. In the years to come, his studio genius would help turn their raw talent into some of the most inventive music ever put to tape. Martin was an unlikely partner for a rock and roll band. Trained in classical music, he had spent years producing comedy albums and novelty songs and orchestral pieces, building a reputation for craft, taste, and a willingness to experiment. He was older than the band, spoke in the polished tones of a different social world, and could easily have looked down on 4 cheeky provincials with rough manners and rougher recordings. Instead, he was intrigued. At their first proper session together, Martin was not immediately bowled over by the songs, which he found unremarkable at first. What won him over was the band themselves, their charm, their humour, and the sheer chemistry that crackled between them. Famously, when he finished explaining the technical side of recording and asked whether there was anything they did not like, one of them cheekily replied that he was not too keen on Martin's necktie. The room dissolved into laughter, and something clicked. Martin realised that whatever these boys had, it was rare, and it could not be taught. He signed them, and then set about the delicate work of turning their live energy into records that would sell. This required changes, some of them difficult. Martin was not fully convinced by their drummer and initially preferred to use a seasoned session player for recording, a decision tangled up with the band's own restlessness about their lineup. He pushed them on song choices and arrangements, steering them toward material that would connect with a wider audience. Crucially, he did all of this without crushing them, guiding rather than dictating, listening as much as he instructed. The partnership worked because of a rare balance. Martin had the technical mastery, the musical training, and the calm authority the band lacked, while they had the raw ideas, the energy, and the fearless imagination he found exhilarating. He could take a rough sketch of a song and hear how to dress it, where to add a piano, how to shape an intro, when to let a moment breathe. As the years passed and their ambitions grew, it was Martin who would figure out how to realise the impossible things they dreamed up, scoring strings, splicing tape, and bending the recording studio to their will. For now, though, the task was simpler and more urgent. They needed a hit. Their first single was a modest, bluesy little number that scraped its way onto the charts, enough to prove they were viable, but not enough to set the world alight. Martin knew they had more in them, and he pushed them toward a follow-up with more spark and drive. When they brought him the song that would become their breakthrough, he helped them sharpen it, speed it up, and polish it into something irresistible. The pieces were now, at last, in place. A band forged in the fires of Hamburg and beloved in the cellars of Liverpool, a manager who believed in them beyond all reason, and a producer with the skill and imagination to capture their magic on record. The long apprenticeship of struggle, rejection, and exhaustion was ending. What lay ahead was something none of them, not even the ever-hopeful Brian, could truly have imagined. The quiet before the storm was nearly over, and the storm, when it came, would be unlike anything the world had ever seen. Just as things began to move, the band made a painful decision. They replaced their original drummer, a handsome and popular local favourite, with a cheerful, big-nosed character from a rival Liverpool group named Ringo Starr. The switch caused an uproar among fans, some of whom felt betrayed and turned out to protest. But Ringo brought a steady, unshowy rhythm and a warm, deadpan humour that fit the group perfectly. The 4 who would conquer the world were at last, completely, in place. The drummer they let go had been with them through the hard years, including the brutal apprenticeship in Germany, and he was arguably the most conventionally handsome of the lot, with a brooding good looks that drew a large and devoted female following back home. On the face of it, sacking him made little sense. He looked the part, the fans adored him, and he had earned his place through the same grinding nights the others had survived. Yet beneath the surface, things had never quite gelled. The reasons were tangled, and the men involved gave different accounts of them over the years. Part of it was musical. Their new producer had reservations about the drumming on their recordings and made it plain that he might use a session player in the studio regardless. Part of it was personal, a sense within the group that their drummer stood slightly apart, socially and temperamentally, never fully one of them. Whatever the true balance of motives, the decision was made, and it fell to their manager to deliver the blow while the others kept their distance. A cold and awkward end to years of shared struggle. Into the seat came Ringo, born Richard Starkey, a drummer the band already knew well from the Liverpool and Hamburg circuit, where he had played with one of the city's most popular groups. He was a little older, sickly as a child and toughened by it, with a dry, understated wit and an easygoing warmth that immediately smoothed the group's chemistry. Crucially, he was a fine drummer of a particular kind, not a flashy show-off, but a rock-steady timekeeper with an instinct for exactly what a song needed, and the discipline to play no more than that. The fans did not take it quietly. When word spread that the beloved drummer was out, loyalists were furious. Crowds gathered outside the cavern, chanting their support for the departed man, and the mood turned ugly enough that George, caught in the middle, ended up with a black eye in the scuffle. For a tense stretch, it seemed the change might cost the band the very local devotion they had worked so hard to build. But the uproar faded, as such things do, and the rightness of the choice quickly became clear. Ringo's playing locked the band together in a way that had eluded them before. His feel for rhythm was so natural and so tasteful that it became a signature of their sound, the solid, swinging foundation over which the others could build. Just as important, his personality completed the group. Where John was sharp, and Paul was charming, and George was quietly intense, Ringo was funny, unpretentious, and impossible to dislike, the good-natured heart of the four. For the first time, the lineup that the world would come to know was fully assembled. Two songwriters at the front, a brilliant young guitarist beside them, and a drummer who anchored it all with warmth and precision. They had their sound, their look, their manager, and their producer. Everything was ready. All that remained was for the records to catch fire, and that moment was now only weeks away. In the closing months of 1962, their debut single crept onto the charts, modest but real, the first proof that all the struggle had counted for something. Then came a follow-up that shot toward the very top, and suddenly radios all across Britain were carrying their songs. Their first album was recorded in a single marathon day, capturing the untamed energy of their live act. The dream they had chased through smoky clubs and slammed doors was finally impossibly becoming real. That first single was a simple, bluesy thing, built around a plaintive harmonica line and a plain, catchy chorus. It was not a masterpiece, and it did not need to be. Reaching the middle of the charts was a genuine achievement for an unknown group from the provinces, and more importantly, it got them onto the radio and out in front of the country. For the band, hearing their own record played over the airwaves for the first time was a thrill they never forgot, the first tangible sign that the wider world might actually be listening. The real breakthrough came with the next release. It was faster, brighter, and irresistibly exuberant, driven along by soaring harmonies and an energy that leapt out of the speakers. When they recorded it, their producer sensed at once that they had something special, and he reportedly told them, as the last note faded, that they had just made their first number one. He was very nearly right. The song raced up the charts, and depending on which listing you consulted, it either topped them outright or came within a whisker of it. Either way, the message was unmistakable. The band had arrived. With momentum building fast, their producer wanted an album out quickly to seize the moment. There was no time and no budget for a leisurely recording process, so the band did what they knew how to do better than anyone. They played their live set. In a single long day in the studio, worn out and battling colds, they blasted through the songs that had made their name in the clubs, cover versions and originals alike, capturing take after take with barely a pause. The final track of that session, a raw and throat-shredding Closer, was recorded in one furious take because their singer's voice was giving out, and there would be no second chance. The result was an album that crackled with the live energy of the cavern, unpolished and alive in a way that carefully layered studio records rarely were. It sounded like a band who had played these songs 1,000 times, because they had. Listeners responded, and the album climbed to the top of the charts, where it settled in for a remarkable run, refusing to budge for month after month. Almost overnight, the shape of their lives changed. The tiny fees of the club circuit gave way to real bookings, real money, and real demand. Newspapers began to take notice. The provincial group that London had sneered at was suddenly a national success, and the pace of everything, the touring, the recording, the interviews, accelerated to a blur. Yet even this was only the opening act. What the band had achieved so far, a run of hit singles and a chart-topping album, would have crowned most careers. For them it was merely the spark. The dry brush of the whole country was primed and waiting, and the fire that was about to catch would burn hotter and spread faster than anything British popular culture had ever witnessed. The word for it had not even been invented yet, but it was coming. What happened next was less a rise to fame than an outright detonation. Across Britain in 1963 the crowd swelled. The screams grew deafening, and newspapers scrambled for a word to capture the hysteria. They found one, and Beatlemania was born. Teenage fans wept, fainted, and clawed at anything the band so much as touched. Almost overnight, 4 young men who'd been sleeping in vans were the most talked about people in the country, and the noise around them was only beginning. It built with frightening speed. Each new single sold faster than the last. Each new appearance drew a larger and more frenzied crowd. What had begun as enthusiastic clapping curdled into something wilder, a collective hysteria that seemed to grip young audiences the instant the band walked on stage. Girls screamed until they lost their voices, sobbed uncontrollably, and in some cases simply passed out and had to be carried away by stewards. The sound in the halls grew so overwhelming that the music itself was often lost beneath it. The press, at first baffled and then delighted, seized on the phenomenon. Reporters who had never covered a pop group found themselves writing front-page stories about the scenes of chaos that followed the band everywhere. The coined word for the madness spread through the newspapers and onto everyone's lips, a tidy label for something no one had ever quite seen before. Overnight, the 4 became a national obsession, their faces on every magazine cover, their haircuts imitated by boys across the country, their every move dissected and reported. A turning point came with a prestigious televised variety show, attended by members of the royal family, performing for such an audience in front of the establishment that had long looked down on their kind of music. The band charmed the entire nation. Their cheeky, self-deprecating humour between songs, delivered with a wink to the grand company in the balconies, won over even the skeptics. It was the moment the phenomenon stopped being a teenage craze and became something the whole country could enjoy, a shared source of pride and delight. The scale of the mania created real practical problems. Getting the band safely into and out of theatres became a military operation, with police holding back crushing crowds, and the group hustled through kitchens, back doors, and hidden exits. Concerts were barely concerts at all, drowned as they were in a wall of screaming that made it pointless even to try to be heard. The music, ironically, was becoming almost beside the point. What the fans came for was the sheer, overwhelming experience of being in the same space as their idols. For the band themselves, it was exhilarating and disorienting in equal measure. They had dreamed of success for years, but nothing could have prepared them for adulation on this scale. They were still young men, only recently scraping by, and now they could not walk down a street without triggering pandemonium. The affection was genuine and enormous, but it also had an unnerving edge, a hunger in the crowds that could tip from love into something dangerous in an instant. Britain had fully surrendered to them, but an island, however devoted, was a small stage for a phenomenon this large, and the great prize, the market that no British act had ever truly cracked, still lay across the ocean. America had ignored or rejected every British pop star before them. The band and their manager set their sights on it anyway, and what happened when they arrived would dwarf even the madness at home. In February of 1964, the band flew to the United States, a country that had never quite embraced a British act before. When they stepped onto a famous Sunday evening television stage, an estimated 73 million Americans were watching, one of the largest audiences the medium had ever seen. The next morning, the whole country woke up changed. America did not merely welcome them, it lost its mind for them, and the little band from Liverpool had officially become a worldwide phenomenon. The ground had been carefully prepared. For all the hysteria at home, British acts had a long and unbroken record of failing in America, and the band knew it. This time, though, something was different. A single had been released in the United States and, against all precedent, had rocketed to the very top of the American charts in the weeks before they arrived. For the first time, the country was primed and curious, its airwaves already saturated with the sound of them. They flew in not as hopeful unknowns, but as the subject of enormous, building anticipation. Even so, the scene that greeted them at the New York airport stunned everyone. Thousands of screaming fans had massed to witness their arrival, a roaring, waving sea of young people who had come simply to catch a glimpse of four men they had never seen in the flesh. It was the first sign that the American reaction might match or even exceed the frenzy back home. The band, gazing out at the crowd, could scarcely believe that all of this was for them. The centerpiece of the visit was an appearance on the most popular variety program in the country, a Sunday night institution watched by families across America. When the band took the stage and launched into their songs, an audience estimated at over 70 million people was tuned in. An astonishing share of the entire nation gathered around their television sets at the same moment. Teenagers shrieked, parents watched in bemusement, and a generation of future musicians sat transfixed, many later saying that this was the night they decided to pick up a guitar. The effect was seismic. In the space of a single broadcast, the band went from a promising import to a full-blown American obsession. Their records flooded the charts, at one point occupying an unprecedented cluster of the top positions all at once, a feat no act had managed before or has managed since in quite the same way. Merchandise appeared everywhere. Their haircuts, their accents, their humour, all of it was suddenly the height of fashion across a country that only weeks earlier had barely heard of them. What made the conquest so complete was not just the music, but the personalities. At their press conferences, the band disarmed the American media exactly as they had charmed the British public, firing off quick, funny, irreverent answers that made hardened reporters laugh out loud. They refused to be pompous or grateful in the expected way, treating the whole circus as a bit of a joke, and America found that refreshing beyond words. They seemed to be having fun, and their joy was infectious. The visit opened the floodgates for a wave of British acts to follow, but none would ever match that first overwhelming breakthrough. The band had done what everyone said could not be done. They had conquered America, and in doing so they had become something genuinely new, a global cultural force. But global fame came with a global price, and the touring life that now stretched before them would soon reveal just how heavy that price could be. Touring at the height of their fame turned into a strange and disorienting ordeal. The screaming in the stadiums was so relentless and so total that the band could no longer hear themselves play. The primitive sound systems of the day stood no chance against tens of thousands of shrieking fans, so the four of them mouthed and strummed their way through sets they could barely make out. Night after night they performed for oceans of people who'd come not to listen but to scream, and slowly the joy of playing began to curdle into pure endurance. The technology of the time simply had not caught up to the size of the crowds they were now drawing. Bands still played through small amplifiers designed for clubs and theatres, equipment utterly inadequate for a stadium packed with tens of thousands of people. There were no towering banks of speakers, no sophisticated monitoring, no way to project sound over a roaring multitude. The result was that the music vanished almost the moment it left the stage, swallowed whole by the wall of noise from the audience. The band adapted in the only way they could. Unable to hear their instruments or one another, they relied on watching each other's hands and mouths, following the visual cues of a downstroke or a nod to stay roughly together. Their drummer, marooned at the back with no chance of hearing the guitars, learned to keep time by watching the others sway and move. On the worst nights they were essentially performing in mime, going through the motions of songs that no one, least of all themselves, could actually hear. For young men who had spent years honing their craft in the clubs, who took real pride in playing well, this was a peculiar kind of torment. The whole point of being a musician, the pleasure of making a good sound, of locking into a groove, of nailing a tricky part had been stripped away. What remained was a spectacle, a ritual in which the band appeared and the crowd screamed and the music was almost incidental. Their playing grew sloppy simply because it no longer seemed to matter, since no one could tell the difference. The crowds themselves were overwhelming to the point of danger. The screaming was not ordinary cheering, but a sustained, piercing roar that could physically hurt the ears, rising to a fever pitch that never let up for the length of the show. Fans wept and shook and reached out with a desperate hunger, and the sheer emotional intensity pouring off the audience was exhausting to stand in front of night after night. It was flattering beyond measure and at the same time faintly frightening. Something essential began to sour. The band had become the biggest live act in the world without being able to give a proper live performance, a bitter irony that gnawed at them more and more. They started to feel like performing animals, trotted out to be screamed at rather than heard, their musicianship irrelevant to the experience they were selling. The exhaustion was not only physical, but creative, a growing sense that this could not be what all those years of practice had been for. They kept at it, because that was what successful bands did, and because the machine around them demanded it. But privately the doubts were accumulating. If the music could not even be heard, what was the point of the endless grind? The question hung over them, unanswered, as the tours rolled on, and the more they thought about it, the more the glittering life of a touring superstar began to look, from the inside, like something closer to a beautifully decorated trap. Off the stage, their lives became a gilded cage. The band was smuggled in and out of venues in laundry vans and armoured cars, marooned in hotel rooms they could not leave without setting off a riot. Fans camped outside their doors, tore at their clothing, and now and then broke through the barricades in a frenzy. What looked from the outside like the most glamorous existence imaginable often felt, from the inside like a lonely and airless confinement. They had everything, and almost no freedom at all. The logistics of moving four of the most famous people alive through a crowded city were staggering. Wherever they went, mobs formed, and those mobs could turn from adoring to dangerous in seconds, not out of malice but out of sheer overwhelming desire to get close. So the band travelled like fugitives, spirited through service entrances and kitchens, hidden in unmarked vehicles, hustled up back staircases by nervous security men. elaborate decoys were sometimes used to draw crowds away from their real route. The whole apparatus existed to keep them safe from the very people who loved them most. Once inside a hotel, they were effectively imprisoned. Stepping outside for a walk, a meal, or a breath of air was simply impossible, because the moment they appeared, pandemonium erupted. Fans laid siege to their hotels, filling the streets below, chanting through the night, jamming the switchboards, and occasionally scaling walls or bribing their way onto the band's floor in hope of a glimpse. The men spent their off hours cooped up in their rooms, ordering food, playing cards, giving endless interviews, and staring out of windows at crowds they could not join. The intrusions could be alarming. Fans hid in laundry carts and closets, impersonated staff, and turned up in the most unlikely places, driven by a longing so intense it overrode all sense. Personal privacy, the ordinary ability to be an anonymous person doing ordinary things, evaporated completely. They could not shop, wander, or sit in a cafe. They could not do any of the small, unremarkable things that make up a normal life. Everything had to be brought to them, or done in secret, or given up entirely. There was a strange loneliness at the centre of all this adulation. Surrounded constantly by handlers, reporters, and screaming strangers, the four increasingly had only one another for genuine company, the only people on earth who truly understood what this life felt like from the inside. That shared experience bound them tightly for a time, a private world of in-jokes and mutual understanding that no outsider could enter. But it was also isolating, a bubble that sealed them off from everyone and everything they had known before. The pace made it worse. The schedule was relentless, a blur of flights, hotels, press conferences and concerts, city after city, country after country, with barely time to register where they were. Days ran together. Exhaustion became permanent. The novelty of luxury wore off quickly when luxury came wrapped in confinement, and there was never a moment to simply stop and breathe. They were young, rich, and beloved beyond imagining, and many of them were also drained, restless, and quietly miserable. Slowly the realization settled in that fame at this scale was not the pure triumph they had once imagined. It was a bargain with hidden costs, and the costs were mounting. Somewhere in those endless hotel rooms a longing began to take shape, a wish for a different kind of life and a different kind of work, one where they might actually be heard and might actually be free. That longing would eventually change everything. But first, the machine would carry them into the movies and onto an even brighter and more exposed stage. To feed the bottomless appetite for all things Beatles, the band moved into film, starring in a pair of movies that showed off their easy charm and rapid-fire wit. The first, shot in crisp black and white, followed a single madcap day in their lives and became a genuine critical hit. The second sent them chasing adventure across sunlit locations abroad. On screen they seemed carefree and hilarious, but between takes the fatigue was mounting, and the men behind the grinning public image were growing weary of the entire circus. The first film was, on paper, a cheap cash-in, the kind of quick, low-budget picture studios routinely threw together to squeeze money out of a passing craze before it faded. Everyone expected it to be forgettable. Instead, thanks to a sharp director, a witty script, and the band's own natural charisma, it turned out to be something far better. A fresh, funny, fast-moving portrait of the madness of their lives, played largely for laughs. It captured the chaos of Beatlemania from the inside, the running from crowds, the confinement, the absurdity of it all, and turned it into joyful comedy. Critics, braced for the worst, were pleasantly astonished. The film was praised as clever and inventive, and the band, to their own surprise, were singled out for their easy, unforced screen presence. They were not trained actors, but they did not need to be. They simply played versions of themselves, trading quick jokes and cheeky asides, and their real chemistry lit up the screen. The movie became a hit and cemented their image as not just musicians but delightful, quick-witted personalities that audiences could not get enough of. The second film followed the formula but bigger, with colour, exotic locations, and a sillier, more elaborate plot. It sent the band on a globe-trotting adventure full of chases and gags, filmed in sunny climates that offered a welcome change from grey concert halls. On screen it was colourful fun, and it produced some of their most beloved songs, but the making of it told a different story. By this point the band were exhausted and increasingly detached, going through the motions of the comedy while privately drifting. It was during the filming of that second movie that some of them first began experimenting with substances that would soon reshape their music, and a certain glazed, going through the motions quality crept into parts of the production. The relentless schedule had worn them down, and the novelty of playing lovable mop-tops for the cameras was wearing thin. They were beginning to feel like a product, packaged and sold, performing a version of themselves that had less and less to do with who they actually were. The films did exactly what they were meant to do, extending the band's reach beyond music into cinema and delighting audiences around the world. They also revealed something important, that the four had genuine charm and comic timing that could carry them well beyond their records. Had they wanted to, they might have built entire careers as screen personalities, but that was never the point. The films were a product of the touring, screaming, packaged phase of their fame, and that whole phase was quietly nearing its end. Behind the grins and the gags, the men were changing. They were growing as artists, growing restless with the treadmill, and growing curious about what else they might become if they stepped off it. The lovable public image was beginning to feel like a costume that no longer fit, and soon an offhand remark, blown far out of proportion, would give them a brutal reminder of just how conditional and fragile the world's affection could be. In 1966, an offhand remark by John about the band's popularity, twisted and amplified as it crossed the ocean, ignited a firestorm across parts of the United States. Radio stations banned their music, crowds gathered to burn their records, and threats began to pour in. What had been a casual observation in a British newspaper became an international scandal. For the first time, the adoration turned to fury, and the band caught a frightening glimpse of just how quickly the love of millions could sour into rage. The remark had originally appeared in a thoughtful newspaper interview back in Britain, part of a wider reflective conversation about religion and modern life. John, never one to guard his tongue, mused that the band had in some ways become more popular among the young than religion itself, and offered a gloomy, provocative observation about the state of organised faith. In the context of a serious British feature, read by a mostly unbothered home audience, the comment passed almost without notice. It was the sort of thing John said all the time. Months later, the interview was reprinted in an American teen magazine, and there it landed very differently. Stripped of its context and reduced to a shocking headline, the remark exploded across the more religious regions of the United States. To many devout Americans, it sounded like unforgivable arrogance, a pop star claiming to outrank the sacred. Outrage spread rapidly. Radio stations announced boycotts, vowing never to play the band's music again. Public bonfires were organised where fans and former fans hurled records and merchandise into the flames. The backlash turned genuinely menacing. Threats were made against the band ahead of an upcoming American tour, and some of them were frightening enough that the group feared for their safety. What had been a triumphant conquest 2 years earlier now looked, in parts of the country, like a hostile campaign. The men who had been adored beyond reason found themselves the target of organised fury, their records burning in the streets of the very nation that had crowned them. Under enormous pressure, and with a major tour hanging in the balance, John was pushed to address the storm publicly. At a tense press conference, visibly uncomfortable and clearly rattled, he tried to explain what he had actually meant, insisting he had not been boasting but making an observation and expressing regret for the offence he had caused. It was a painful, awkward moment for a man who prized his own honesty and hated to be seen backing down. The apology was accepted by some and rejected by others, but it took enough heat out of the situation for the tour to proceed. The episode left a deep mark. It was the first time the band had experienced the dark underside of their fame on this scale, the realization that the same public passion that lifted them up could just as easily be turned against them, and that a single careless sentence could put them in real danger. The screaming crowds, they now understood, were fickle, and the love could curdle in an instant. It was a sobering, even chilling lesson in the nature of mass adoration. Coming on top of the exhaustion, the confinement, and the growing pointlessness of playing to crowds who could not hear them, the controversy helped push the band toward a decision that had been forming for some time. The touring life had become dangerous as well as unbearable. The joy had drained out of it entirely. And so, as that troubled tour wound toward its close, the four quietly resolved that it would be their last. The end of the road was now just one concert away. By the summer of 1966, touring had become unbearable, unsafe, and creatively pointless. So on a cold, wind-swept evening in San Francisco, the band walked onto a stadium stage, played a short set to a half-empty ballpark and walked off, having quietly agreed among themselves that they would never tour again. There was no grand announcement, no farewell to the fans. The most famous live band on earth simply stopped, closing one chapter of their story and preparing, whether they yet knew it or not, to begin their greatest one. The decision had been building for months. Everything about touring had turned sour. The deafening screams that buried the music, the confinement and the danger, the relentless grind, and finally the frightening backlash that had made the latest American tour feel less like a celebration than a gauntlet. The band no longer enjoyed a single part of it. They played worse and worse, unable to hear themselves, and took no pride in performances that were really just spectacles. Privately, all four had come to the same conclusion. They could not go on like this. The final show took place at a large baseball stadium in San Francisco, chosen almost at random as the last stop on a tour they were desperate to finish. The venue was far from full, a telling sign that even the mania was beginning to cool. It was a chilly, windy night, and the band took the stage knowing, quietly and without ceremony, that this was the end. One of them reportedly brought a camera and snapped a few photographs from the stage, wanting to mark the moment for himself, aware that something was closing, even if the world did not yet know it. They played a brief set of familiar songs, the same kind of show they had given hundreds of times, to the usual wall of screaming that made the music nearly inaudible. There was no special announcement, no emotional goodbye to the crowd, nothing to signal that history was being made. The fans who were there had no idea they were witnessing the last time the band would ever perform a proper concert. The four simply finished, left the stage, and that was that. The touring life was over. The relief they felt was enormous. Freed from the treadmill of live shows, they could finally slow down, breathe, and think about what they actually wanted to do. For the first time in years, there were no crowds to run from, no stadiums to fill, no screaming to endure. The pressure that had been crushing them lifted, and in its place opened up something they had almost forgotten they possessed: time. Time to rest, to grow, and to reimagine what their music could be. There was some risk in the decision. A band that stopped touring gave up the most direct connection to its audience, and defied every rule of the industry, which held that stars had to be seen to stay relevant. Some wondered whether a group that vanished from the stage might simply fade away. But the band had something more valuable than a touring schedule. They had the recording studio and an ambition that had been straining against the limits of live performance for a long time. The end of touring was not a retreat, but a liberation. Released from the impossible demands of the road, the four turned inward, toward the studio, toward experimentation, toward the pure pursuit of sound unshackled from anything they would ever have to reproduce on a stage. The screaming had finally stopped, and in the sudden, unfamiliar quiet, they were about to discover what they were truly capable of. Freed from the road, the band retreated into the recording studio and were reborn. No longer bound by what four musicians could reproduce on a stage, they began to treat the studio itself as an instrument, layering sounds, running tapes backward, and chasing ideas no one had attempted before. Their producer and his engineers became full creative partners in a laboratory of relentless experiment. The screaming had stopped, and in the sudden quiet the band discovered they could conjure almost anything they could imagine. For their entire career up to this point, their music had been shaped by a hidden constraint. Every song had to be playable live by four men with guitars and drums, because sooner or later they would have to perform it in front of a screaming crowd. That limit had quietly governed everything they wrote and recorded. Now, with touring behind them, the constraint simply vanished. If a song called for an orchestra, a sound effect, or an impossible tangle of overlapping parts, none of it mattered, because no one would ever have to recreate it on a stage. This freedom unlocked a torrent of invention. The band began to think of the studio not as a place to capture a performance, but as a tool for building sounds from scratch piece by piece. They layered instrument upon instrument, voice upon voice, constructing rich, dense recordings far beyond anything four players could produce at once. They pushed their producer and his engineers to try things that had never been done, and rather than resisting, those technicians rose to the challenge, inventing new techniques on the spot to satisfy the band's ever stranger requests. The experiments grew genuinely radical. They recorded sounds and then played them backward, discovering an eerie, otherworldly quality in reversed music. They spliced together loops of tape into swirling collages, sped recordings up and slowed them down, and treated voices and instruments with newly invented effects to make them shimmer, blur. They borrowed from classical music, from the sounds of India, from the avant-garde experiments happening at the edges of the art world, folding it all into records that still, somehow, worked as songs. Their producer proved the ideal collaborator for this new phase. With his classical training and his taste for experiment, he could take the band's often vague and dreamlike instructions, a request for a song to sound like a particular colour or like a feeling, and translate them into concrete musical decisions. He scored string arrangements, orchestrated breaths, and figured out the technical trickery needed to realise their visions. The partnership between the band's boundless imagination and his craft became one of the most productive in the history of recorded music. The albums that emerged from this period were unlike anything popular music had produced before. The songs grew more sophisticated, more varied, and more adventurous, moving far beyond the simple love songs of their early years into strange and beautiful new territory. Listeners who had known them only as makers of catchy singles found themselves confronted with music of startling depth and ambition. The band were no longer just entertainers. They were becoming artists in the fullest sense, using the studio to expand the very definition of what a record could be. It was a transformation born directly out of their decision to stop touring. By walking away from the stage, they had gained the freedom to become something greater. And all of this experimentation, all of this newfound daring, was building toward a single landmark work, an album that would gather every strand of their ambition into one dazzling statement and change the course of popular music forever. The middle of the decade found the band experimenting not only with sound, but with the mind-altering substances then sweeping through the artistic world. those experiences, for better and for worse, seeped into their music, opening the door to stranger lyrics, swirling arrangements, and a bolder, more dreamlike palette. Their songs grew more ambitious and more surreal, drifting far from the simple love tunes of their early days. Whatever one makes of that period, the music it produced stretched the very definition of what a popular record could be. To understand this shift, it helps to remember the moment. The middle years of the 1960s were a time of enormous cultural upheaval, when a generation was questioning old rules about art, society, and consciousness itself. Among artists and musicians, certain substances had become fashionable, promoted by some as gateways to new ways of seeing and creating. The band, curious and surrounded by this ferment, followed the current of the times, and the effects on their imagination were unmistakable. It is not the place of a bedtime story to dwell on the details or to pretend the experiences were harmless. They were not. What matters here is how they changed the music. Songs that had once been direct and straightforward began to bend and shimmer. Lyrics grew impressionistic and strange, full of vivid imagery and half-glimpsed dreamscapes. The band started reaching for sounds that matched these altered states, textures that were hazy, kaleidoscopic, and unlike anything on the radio. The influences did not stop there. Around the same time, one member in particular grew fascinated with the music and spiritual traditions of India, taking up an unfamiliar stringed instrument and weaving its drones and scales into the band's recordings. This Eastern flavour added yet another colour to their expanding palette, further loosening the band from the conventions of Western pop. They were pulling in ideas from every direction, high art and folk tradition, classical and experimental, and blending them into something wholly their own. Their producer and engineers, meanwhile, were pushing the technology of the studio to keep pace with the band's ballooning imagination. New recording tricks made it possible to conjure the swirling, disorienting effects the music now seemed to demand. Voices could be made to sound as though they were coming from underwater or from another dimension. Instruments could be distorted, layered, and treated until they became unrecognizable. The studio became a kind of dream factory, capable of realizing sounds that existed nowhere in the physical world. Not everyone approved. To some observers, the band had strayed dangerously from the wholesome, cheerful image that had made them beloved, and there were mutterings that their new direction was self-indulgent or worse. Parents who had tolerated the earlier hits grew wary, but the young audience, hungry for exactly this kind of adventure, embraced the change wholeheartedly. The band was giving voice to a restless, searching mood in the culture, and listeners followed them eagerly into the unknown. Whatever the costs, and there were real costs, this period of experimentation transformed the band from gifted pop craftsmen into fearless sonic explorers. They had thrown off the last of their old constraints and were now willing to try absolutely anything in pursuit of a new sound. All of this daring, all of this restless invention, was gathering momentum, building toward a single towering achievement. Every strange new technique, every borrowed influence, every dreamlike lyric was leading to one album that would pull it all together and astonish the entire world. In 1967, the band unveiled a record unlike anything the world had heard. A lavish, technicolor work wrapped in what would become one of the most famous covers ever made. They invented a fictional band as an alter ego, freeing themselves to try absolutely anything, and the result reshaped what popular music dared to aspire to. It was hailed almost instantly as a masterpiece, a cultural landmark that seemed to bottle an entire summer in sound. From four screaming teenage idols, they had transformed into serious artists, and the whole world noticed. The concept behind the album was ingenious. Weary of being the band that everyone thought they knew, the four decided to record as though they were a completely different group. an imaginary ensemble with a colourful, old-fashioned name. This simple bit of make-believe was strangely liberating. Hiding behind invented characters, they felt free to abandon every expectation attached to their real selves, to dress up, play roles, and indulge any musical whim without worrying whether it fit their established image. Freed in this way, they poured months of work into the recording, an unheard-of luxury at a time when albums were often knocked out in a matter of days. They laboured over every detail, building the songs layer by painstaking layer and drawing on the full arsenal of studio tricks they'd been developing. Orchestras were brought in and arranged in wild, unconventional ways. Everyday sounds and sound effects were woven into the music. The songs flowed one into another, giving the whole album the feel of a single continuous performance, rather than a collection of separate tracks. The variety was astonishing. The record moved from whimsical, music hall charm to swirling psychedelia, from tender ballads to a shattering apocalyptic climax built around a vast orchestral crescendo unlike anything in pop before it. There were songs about ordinary life, about aging, about escape and longing and the passage of time, all rendered with a richness and inventiveness that repaid endless listening. It rewarded not the screaming of a stadium, but the close, careful attention of headphones in a darkened room. Even the packaging was revolutionary. The album arrived in an elaborate cover crowded with a collage of famous faces, an image that became instantly iconic and endlessly imitated. The lyrics were printed for listeners to read along, treating the words as poetry worthy of study. Everything about the release signalled that this was not disposable pop but a considered work of art, meant to be pondered and preserved. It changed the very idea of what an album could be, elevating the form from a bundle of singles into a unified artistic statement. The reception was rapturous. Critics who had once dismissed pop music as trivial found themselves reaching for the language of high art to describe it. The album seemed to capture the mood of an entire cultural moment, becoming the soundtrack to a season that people would remember for the rest of their lives. It topped the charts around the world and settled into history as one of the most influential records ever made, a work that every ambitious musician who followed had to reckon with. The band had reached a creative summit that few artists in any field ever attain. They had turned their backs on the stage and in doing so produced their masterpiece. It should have been the happiest moment of their lives, a triumph beyond anything they had dreamed of as boys in Liverpool. But even as the world celebrated their greatest achievement, a private catastrophe was about to strike, one that would leave the band suddenly, frighteningly alone. At the very peak of this triumph came a devastating blow. In August of 1967, Brian Epstein, the manager who had believed in them when no one else would, died suddenly at the age of 32. He had guided them from a Liverpool basement to the summit of the world, quietly handling the business, the image, and the countless problems they never even saw. With him gone, the band was left adrift. 4 immensely gifted young men suddenly without the steady hand that had held everything together. It was a wound that never fully healed. Brian had given the band everything. From the moment he first descended those cellar steps and decided to stake his life on them, he had devoted himself completely to their success, managing not only their careers but the endless practical burdens they had neither the patience nor the ability to handle themselves. He negotiated the contracts, arranged the tours, soothed the crises, and shielded them from a business world they barely understood. He was the buffer between the 4 musicians and the harsh machinery of fame, and because he did his job so well, they rarely had to think about any of it. His death came at a cruel moment. The band had just released their masterpiece and were riding higher than ever, and yet the man who had made it all possible would not live to see the fullest flowering of what he had built. He had been struggling privately for some time, worn down by pressures and loneliness that those around him only partly understood, and his death was ruled to be the result of an accidental overdose of the medication he'd been taking. He was still a young man, only in his early 30s, with what should have been decades ahead of him. For the band, the loss was shattering on more than one level. They had genuinely loved Brian, who had been a constant presence in their lives through the most extraordinary years imaginable, a friend and protector as much as a manager. His sudden absence tore a hole in the small, tight world they had built. They were grief-stricken in the simple human way of people who have lost someone dear to them, and the shock of it lingered long after the initial blow. But there was also a colder, more practical dread underneath the grief. Without Brian, no one was steering the ship. For years he had absorbed all the difficult, tedious, unglamorous work of running their affairs, leaving the four free to make music. Now that work fell to them, and they were spectacularly unsuited to it. None of them had the temperament or the training for business. They were artists, not administrators, and they suddenly found themselves responsible for a vast and complicated enterprise, with no one at the helm who truly knew what he was doing. Some of them later reflected that Brian's death marked the real beginning of the end, the moment the glue that held everything together began to dissolve. While he lived, the band had a centre, a single trusted authority who kept the peace and made the decisions. With him gone, there was no one to fill that role, and the small disagreements and diverging ambitions that any group of four strong-willed men will have began, slowly, to fester without anyone to manage them. They pressed on because there seemed no other choice, and they threw themselves into new projects to fill the void. But the ground beneath them had shifted. The protected, focused existence Brian had made possible was over, and a more chaotic and fractious chapter was beginning. Searching for meaning and direction in the wake of the loss, the four would soon travel halfway around the world in pursuit of peace, to a quiet retreat in the mountains of India. Shaken and searching for something deeper, the band travelled to northern India in early 1968 to study meditation at the retreat of a spiritual teacher. For a few weeks they lived simply, far from the madness, waking to birdsong and passing their days in quiet reflection and songwriting. The trip produced a remarkable burst of creativity and a large stockpile of new songs, but it also exposed the cracks between them, differing hopes and quiet disappointments that hinted the tight brotherhood of their early years was beginning to loosen. The journey grew out of a fascination that had been building for some time. One member in particular had immersed himself in Indian music and philosophy, and through him the whole band had been drawn toward the teachings of a meditation master who promised inner peace through a simple daily practice. In the aftermath of Brian's death and the exhaustion of their fame, the idea of retreating to a tranquil ashram to look inward held enormous appeal. So they went, along with their partners and a scattering of other famous seekers, to a compound nestled in the foothills where a great river ran down from the mountains. For a while it was idyllic. Cut off from the pressures of the outside world, the band settled into a gentle rhythm of meditation, lectures, and long unhurried days. They ate simple vegetarian food, walked among the trees, and enjoyed a peace and privacy they had not known in years. For men who had spent so long trapped in hotel rooms and hounded by crowds, the simple freedom to sit quietly in the sun was a balm. The setting seemed to calm them, and for a time the old camaraderie flickered back to life. Above all, the retreat proved astonishingly fertile for songwriting. Freed from distractions and surrounded by natural beauty, the band wrote at a furious pace, producing a huge batch of new material in a matter of weeks. Sitting with acoustic guitars in the mountain air, they poured out song after song, drawing on the calm around them and the turbulence within. This wealth of material would form the backbone of their next album and beyond, one of the most productive creative spells of their entire career. But the harmony did not last. As the weeks wore on, the members grew restless at different rates, and for different reasons. Some tired of the routine and the isolation more quickly than others. Doubts crept in about their teacher and the whole enterprise, and disagreements arose over how long to stay and whether the promised enlightenment was real. One by one they peeled away, some leaving early in disillusionment, others lingering until the group that had arrived together departed in fragments, their unity quietly frayed. The differing reactions to India revealed something important. The four were no longer the interchangeable unit they had once seemed, four lads who did everything together. They were becoming distinct individuals with their own beliefs, needs, and paths, and the retreat that was meant to bring them peace instead threw their growing differences into sharp relief. The spiritual quest that one of them embraced deeply left another cold, and these divergences were harder to paper over than the small squabbles of the past. Still, they returned home richer than they had left, armed with an extraordinary trove of songs and eager to record them. What they could not yet see was that the very abundance of that material and the increasingly separate visions behind it would strain the group as never before. The peaceful mountain retreat had given them their next great work. It had also, quietly, planted the seeds of their unravelling. The songs from India swelled into a sprawling double album, brilliant and chaotic in almost equal measure. But the recording sessions grew tense and fractured, with the four increasingly working alone rather than together, each chasing his own separate vision. The warmth that had once bound them was cooling into irritation and rivalry. At one point their drummer walked out entirely, convinced he was no longer wanted. The music was extraordinary, yet behind it the family was quietly beginning to come apart. The sheer volume of material they had written in India presented a happy problem. They had far too many songs for a single album, so they decided to release a double, a huge and varied collection that sprawled across 4 sides. The range was breathtaking, from delicate acoustic ballads to hard-driving rock, from gentle whimsy to snarling experiment, even a stretch of pure avant-garde sound collage. Almost every style the band had ever touched appeared somewhere on the record, along with several they had never tried before. But the way it was made told a troubling story. In the early days, the band had recorded together, 4 musicians in a room feeding off one another's energy. Now, more and more, they worked apart. Each songwriter tended to treat his own compositions as personal projects, directing the others as backing musicians rather than true collaborators. Songs were often built around whoever had written them, with the rest contributing when needed and drifting off when not. The collective spirit that had defined them was giving way to a collection of individuals sharing a studio. The atmosphere curdled. Long hours, artistic disagreements, and simmering personal tensions made the sessions fractious and unhappy. Arguments broke out over how songs should be played and how much time each member's material deserved. The presence of partners and outsiders in the studio, once unthinkable, added to the friction. The producer, who had presided over their greatest triumphs, found the mood so difficult that he stepped back from parts of the process. It was a far cry from the joyful unity of their rise. The breaking point for a time came when their drummer, feeling sidelined and underappreciated, simply walked out. Convinced that the others no longer needed or valued him, he left the band during the sessions and went away to clear his head, uncertain whether he would return. For a tense stretch the group carried on without him, a stark sign of how strained things had become. In the end the others coaxed him back, welcoming him with a show of affection, and he returned to find his drum kit decorated with flowers. But the fact that it had happened at all spoke volumes, and yet, for all the tension, the music that emerged was remarkable. The very looseness and diversity that reflected the band's fragmentation also made the album a fascinating, unpredictable sprawl, full of surprises and hidden gems. Working somewhat independently, each member produced some of his finest and most personal work. The record captured 4 distinct artists at the height of their individual powers, even as the bond between them weakened. Its brilliance and its disorder were 2 sides of the same coin. The double album stands as a strange and pivotal moment, a peak of creativity built on a foundation that was cracking. The band was still capable of extraordinary things, but they were no longer quite a band in the old sense. They were 4 gifted men whose paths were diverging, held together now more by habit and history than by the easy closeness of before. And as they grew apart as artists, they were also growing apart as people, pulled in new directions by the lives and loves they were building outside the group. As the decade wore on, the men grew up, fell in love, and built lives that pulled them in separate directions. John's intense new partnership with the artist Yoko Ono, in particular, marked a turning point, as he brought her into the once sacred inner circle of the studio. To some in the band, it felt like an intrusion, a sign that the 4 were no longer the whole of one another's worlds. There was no villain in any of this, only 4 grown men slowly and inevitably becoming individuals again. For years, the band had been an almost closed world, 4 young men bound together by a shared experience that no one outside could fully understand. Their girlfriends and wives had existed on the edges of that world, kept largely separate from the work itself. The studio in particular had been a private sanctum, a space reserved for the 4 of them and their trusted collaborators. That arrangement had held through all the years of touring and triumph, an unspoken rule that the band came first. The arrival of a serious new relationship in John's life changed that. He had met an avant-garde artist whose bold, unconventional work and fierce independence captivated him completely, and the 2 became inseparable in a way that went far beyond an ordinary romance. She became his creative and emotional partner in everything, and John, following his heart as he always did, refused to leave her at the studio door. He brought her inside, into the very heart of the band's private world, and expected the others to accept her presence as a matter of course. For the other 3, accustomed to the old closed circle, this was jarring. It was not that they necessarily disliked her, though tension certainly arose, but that her constant presence broke a pattern that had defined their working lives for years. The studio was no longer just the 4 of them. The private language and easy shorthand of the band now had an observer, and the dynamic shifted. To men already growing apart, it felt like one more sign that the group was no longer the centre of John's universe, and perhaps no longer the centre of any of theirs. It would be unfair to lay the band's troubles at the feet of any one relationship, and unfair to cast anyone as the culprit. The truth was gentler and sadder than that. The 4 were simply growing up. They'd come together as teenagers and lived through the most extraordinary decade imaginable joined at the hip, but now they were grown men in their late 20s, with wives, children, homes, and interests of their own. It was natural, even inevitable, that their individual lives would expand and their shared life would contract. Each was developing his own identity beyond the band. One was deepening his spiritual pursuits and his songwriting. One was throwing himself into managing the group's affairs and defending its future. One was quietly steady, content in his family life. And one had found a new great love and a new artistic direction that pointed away from the group. These were not betrayals. They were the ordinary evolutions of maturing people, but they placed enormous strain on a partnership built for young men with nothing but each other and their music. The closeness that had powered their rise could not survive their growing up entirely intact. The band was becoming a thing they belonged to rather than a thing they were, and as the personal distances widened, they were about to collide with a set of problems perfectly designed to turn friends into adversaries. The cold, corrosive world of money and business, which without Brian to manage it, was descending into chaos. The band had founded their own company, an idealistic venture meant to free artists from the usual corporate machinery. Instead, it became a financial disaster, bleeding money and swarming with hangers-on. Without Brian to steer things, the four found themselves buried in contracts, arguments, and the grinding misery of business decisions they were never equipped to make. The fight over who should take control of their affairs became one of the bitterest wedges between them, poisoning friendships that had lasted a lifetime. The company had been born from a genuinely lovely idea. Flush with success and full of 60s optimism, the band had dreamed of creating an organisation that would not just handle their own affairs, but nurture other artists, fund creative projects, and operate on generous, idealistic principles rather than cold profit. It was to be a kind of benevolent artistic playground, a place where talent could flourish free of the greed and cynicism of the ordinary music business. It was a beautiful vision, and it was almost completely impractical. Reality quickly intruded. The four musicians, however brilliant, had no idea how to run a business, and in the absence of Brian's steady management, the enterprise descended into chaos. Money poured out in every direction, spent on schemes that went nowhere, and projects that were never finished. The offices filled with hangers-on, freeloaders, and opportunists who saw an easy source of funds and helped themselves. Well-meaning but naive, the band watched their idealistic dream turn into a money-losing shambles that threatened their fortunes. Something clearly had to be done, and here the real trouble began. The band agreed that they needed a strong hand to take control of their tangled affairs, but they could not agree on whose hand it should be. A faction favoured one hard-nosed manager, a tough, aggressive figure who promised to sort out the mess. Another member, guided by advisors from his wife's family, wanted a different, more conventional approach and deeply distrusted the alternative. The disagreement was fundamental, and it split the band down the middle. This was not a minor squabble over a business detail. It became a bitter, entrenched conflict that struck at the trust holding the group together. Some of them felt railroaded and outnumbered. Others felt their genuine concerns were being ignored. Lawyers and advisors crowded in, each pushing their own interests, and the atmosphere grew poisonous. Men who had once shared everything now found themselves on opposing sides of a cold and increasingly hostile dispute, their old affection buried under layers of suspicion and resentment. The financial and legal entanglements grew so complex that they seemed almost designed to keep the band chained together in mutual misery. Contracts bound them tightly, and unwinding the mess would require years of painful negotiation. What had begun as an idealistic gesture of artistic freedom had become a suffocating burden, a source of constant friction that made every meeting an ordeal. The business, meant to liberate them, had instead trapped them in a web of obligation and conflict. By this point, the emotional damage was severe. The disputes over money and management had done what artistic differences alone might not have, turning brothers into rivals and draining away the goodwill that had survived so much. The band still existed on paper and would still make music together, but the trust at its foundation had been badly, perhaps fatally wounded. And yet, even in the midst of all this bitterness, they had one more surprise left in them, a spontaneous, joyful moment that would give the world its last glimpse of them as a living band, up on a rooftop in the heart of London. In the winter of 1969, in the middle of tense and unhappy sessions, the band climbed to the roof of their London office building and played an impromptu concert for the streets below. Office workers craned their necks, traffic slowed to a halt, and baffled police eventually shut the whole thing down. It was loose, joyful, and unexpectedly moving. The four of them making music together in the open air one last time. None of them said it aloud, but that chilly rooftop set would be the final time the world ever saw them perform live as a band. The rooftop show came at the end of a fraught project. The band had set out to make an album by returning to their roots, recording live in the studio without the elaborate layering of their recent work, and the whole thing was being filmed. But the sessions had been miserable, marked by boredom, arguments, and a pervasive sense that the group was falling apart. They needed some kind of ending for the film, a climactic performance, and after much debate they settled on the simplest and strangest option available, the roof of their own headquarters. On a cold January afternoon, they hauled their equipment up to the rooftop, set up in the biting wind, and simply began to play. They had not performed live together in front of any audience for well over 2 years, since the day they walked off that stadium stage and swore off touring. Now, without warning or announcement, they were doing it again, high above a busy London street, running through a handful of new songs as the wind whipped at them and the film cameras rolled. The effect on the streets below was immediate and wonderful. The sound of the band drifted down over the neighbourhood, and people stopped in their tracks, wondering where the music was coming from. Office workers leaned out of windows and clambered onto neighbouring roofs to see. Crowds gathered in the street, gazing upward, some delighted and some merely puzzled by the commotion. For a few surreal minutes, an ordinary workday in the city was interrupted by the sound of the most famous band in the world, playing where no one could quite see them. Up on the roof, something loosened in the four of them. Despite all the tension of the preceding weeks, the simple act of playing live together seemed to rekindle a spark of the old joy. They grinned, they joked between numbers, they fed off one another's energy in a way they had not done in ages. For a little while the lawyers and the arguments and the growing distances fell away, and they were just four musicians from Liverpool, doing the thing they had always loved best, playing music side by side. It could not last. The noise and the gathering crowds eventually drew complaints, and the police made their way up to the roof to bring the performance to a close. The band played on for as long as they could get away with, then finally wound down, with one of them wryly thanking the imaginary audience on behalf of the group. The equipment was packed away, and the four descended from the roof back into the ordinary world and into the unresolved troubles waiting below. No one present understood the full weight of the moment, but it would prove to be the last time the band ever played for an audience. That impromptu, half-chaotic rooftop set was their farewell performance, a fittingly unpolished and human goodbye from a group that had started in cellars and vans. There would be one more great album to come, a deliberate and beautiful parting gift. But as a living, breathing, performing band, the rooftop was where it ended, in the cold wind above a London street. Even as their partnership crumbled, the band summoned the will for one final masterpiece, a polished and gorgeous album named after the street outside their favourite studio. They set their grievances aside just long enough to create something they sensed might be their farewell, closing the record with a suite of songs that played like a deliberate final bow. It was recorded by men who could feel the end drawing near and chose to meet it with grace. The result endures as one of the most beloved records they ever made. By this point, the band knew in their hearts that the end was near. The business disputes were unresolved, the personal distances had widened, and the sessions for their Back to Basics project had left a sour taste. Rather than let that miserable experience be their final word, they made a conscious decision to come together one more time and make an album properly with care and craft, reuniting with the producer who had shaped their greatest work. It was, in a sense, an act of will, a determination to end on a high note rather than in acrimony. For this last effort, they returned to the meticulous, layered approach that had produced their finest studio albums. The result was lush, immaculate, and warm, showcasing the full range of their talents one final time. The songwriting was strong across the board, with each member contributing standout moments, including some of the most admired songs any of them ever wrote. There was a maturity and a polish to the record, the sound of seasoned artists at the peak of their powers, even as everything around them was coming undone. The most remarkable achievement was the album's second half, a long, flowing medley in which fragments of songs were woven together into a single continuous piece of music. It was an ambitious and ingenious structure, stitching together bits and pieces the band had lying around into something greater than the sum of its parts. As the medley built toward its close, it took on the unmistakable feel of a grand finale, a summing up, as though the band were consciously gathering all their gifts for one last statement. Fittingly, the album ended with a short, graceful passage that felt like a deliberate farewell, a gentle closing thought offered to the world by a band that knew it was saying goodbye. The very last proper song they recorded together as a group closed the medley with a simple, generous sentiment about love given and received, a nearly perfect final note on which to end an unparalleled career. Whether by design or by instinct, they had crafted an ending worthy of everything that had come before. The making of the album was not without its tensions, and the old frictions surfaced now and then, but there was also a sense of occasion, a shared understanding among the four that they were doing something for the last time, and that awareness seemed to bring out their best. They set aside enough of their differences to give the work the attention it deserved, and in doing so they gave themselves and their fans a parting gift of extraordinary beauty. When the album was released, it was a triumph, embraced by critics and public alike, and destined to become one of the most cherished records in popular music. But behind the scenes, the four had essentially reached the end of the road. They had made their farewell, whether or not the world yet realized it. All that remained was for the ending to become official, and when it finally did, it would arrive not with a gentle goodbye, but with a public announcement that stunned millions and closed the book on the most beloved band in history. In 1970, it was over. Paul publicly announced that he was leaving, and the most beloved band in history dissolved into lawsuits, hurt feelings, and years of bitter public sniping. Each man went on to a solo career, and for a while it seemed the wounds might never mend. Then, in 1980, John Lennon was shot and killed outside his home in New York, and the hope of any reunion died with him. George Harrison passed away in 2001, leaving Paul and Ringo to carry the memory forward. Yet more than half a century on, the music has never faded, and four boys from a rainy northern city remain quietly and permanently the most famous band the world has ever known. The end, when it came, was messy and painful. Though the group had effectively stopped functioning, no one had made it official, and the members were still entangled in their bitter business disputes. It was Paul who finally broke the silence, announcing publicly that he was stepping away from the band, a statement that landed like a thunderclap and confirmed what many had feared. Fans around the world were heartbroken. The dissolution was formalized through a long and unhappy legal process, the four of them battling through the courts to untangle the affairs that bound them together. The aftermath was strewn with hard feelings. In the immediate years after the split, some of the former bandmates traded public criticisms and nursed old grievances. The closeness of their youth curdled into resentment. Each threw himself into a solo career, and all of them found success on their own terms, proving they had never needed the group to make meaningful music. Slowly, as time passed and the heat of the breakup cooled, the friendships began tentatively to heal. The four would never reunite as a band, but the personal wounds gradually softened and warmth crept back into their relationships. Then came the tragedy that ended any lingering dream of a reunion forever. In late 1980, John Lennon was shot and killed outside his home in New York City, murdered by a disturbed stranger. He was only 40 years old. The news devastated the world and plunged his former bandmates and millions of fans into grief. A voice that had helped define an era was suddenly, senselessly silenced. Whatever faint hope had existed that the four might one day play together again was gone in an instant, replaced by mourning for a man taken far too soon. The remaining three carried on, honouring John's memory and continuing their own musical journeys. Decades later, the band suffered another loss when George Harrison, the quiet, deeply spiritual guitarist who had joined as a schoolboy, died of cancer in the opening year of the new century. Two of the four were now gone. Paul and Ringo remained, the surviving keepers of an extraordinary shared history, still making music and still, whenever they spoke of it, clearly marked by the astonishing thing the four of them had built together. What they built has proved astonishingly durable. More than half a century after they went their separate ways, the band's music remains as beloved and as widely heard as ever, passed down through generation after generation who discover it anew. Their songs are woven into the fabric of the modern world, their influence audible in nearly everything that came after. The scruffy group from the Liverpool cellars did not just achieve fame, they changed music, changed culture, and changed what a band could be. And that, in the end, is the strange and beautiful truth behind all the screaming and the chaos and the heartbreak. Four ordinary boys from a rainy northern port shaped by grief and hunger and a shared love of a sound drifting off the docks came together at exactly the right moment and made something that outlived their fame, their friendships, and even their lives. The band is gone, but the music remains, playing on quietly in the dark, as it will for as long as anyone still wants to listen. And so the story goes gently to rest. Four boys from a grey and rainy port city, born into rationing and rubble, bound together by grief and a stubborn love of a sound that drifted in off the docks. They chased it through freezing vans and squalid German backrooms, through sweaty cellars and slammed London doors, until somehow the whole world turned to look at them all at once. We tend to remember only the triumph, the matching suits, and the screaming crowds, the #1 records and the Meng-like albums. But behind the fame were four tired, funny, fallible human beings, trapped in hotel rooms they could not leave, playing music no one could hear, growing up in front of an audience of millions with nowhere private left to stand. They gained everything and lost a great deal of ordinary freedom in the bargain, and through it all, they somehow kept making things of astonishing beauty. Their partnership could not last forever. Friendships frayed, business soured, and grief eventually took two of them far too soon. That is the quiet truth beneath every legend. The people are only people, and people do not last. But what they made together has outlived the fame, the feuds, and even the men themselves, playing on softly through generation after generation who were not yet born when the band walked away. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep in the comfort of your own quiet room, spare a gentle thought for those four ordinary boys who reached for something extraordinary and caught it. They remind us that even the brightest fame is fragile, that the truest things we leave behind are the ones we make with love, and that a little music made by friends can echo far longer than anyone ever dreams. Rest well, the song plays on.